Many people know Vancouver as the home of Insight, the first supervised drug injection site in the world, but few may know about Hollywood Hospital, itself a pioneer in harm reduction that existed decades ago in Westminster. Between 1957 and 1968, its operators supervised more than 6,000 acid trips to treat everything from alcoholism and anxiety to depression and marital difficulties. Now it's the subject of a new book, The Acid Room: The Psychedelic Trials and Tribulations of Hollywood Hospital. Co-author Erika Dyck is a professor and a Canada Research Chair in the history of health and social justice at the University of Saskatchewan, and she joins me now. Welcome to the bookshelf, Erika.
Thanks, John.
Now, you've written about psychedelics before. What attracted you to this acid room story in particular?
Yeah, this group of records at the Hollywood Hospital had this enchanting history. There was a story that the records had been taken away by one of the former therapists and they weren't available, and they became available at the BC archives. And so I was really keen to get access to these records, which were held and conducted in a private hospital, sort of off the grid in some respects, and not in Kitsilano where you might expect, but often New Westminster in the 50s and 60s, kind of during the heyday of psychedelics. But here with a bunch of white-coated folks who were in their own way, they were radical, but they aren't sort of your typical psychonauts as you might expect. So I was really intrigued by the sort of contradictions that were inherently woven into this story.
Now, the book begins with a capsule history of LSD and its, to me, little known Vancouver area connections. It was fascinating to see you and your co-author Jesse Donaldson fit these puzzle pieces together, as I'm sure it was for you.
Yeah, I've looked at the history of LSD and psychedelics in Canada before, and Vancouver had sort of loomed large, but there was this sort of dark spot with lack of access to records. And so Jesse and I had a lot of fun. We'd never met. He called me about doing some research together, and we thought about, working together through COVID. And so we were able to pool our resources this way and bring some of the materials I collected over years about Canadian trials and put those into conversation. Like you said, it very much was a process of putting puzzle pieces in place, trying to fill in these gaps and come up with ways of understanding these really dynamic and quite fascinating people who came through this facility.
Now, the book takes its name from the acid room at the Hollywood Hospital. What happened in there?
Yeah, so the acid room was sort of set aside. One of the directors who came in 1957 decided to start working with psychedelics. Otherwise, this had been a longstanding facility that treated tuberculosis. It also treated addictions. But LSD and mescaline and later psilocybin were being used in ways that weren't necessarily controversial. They just weren't yet mainstream, and they weren't really accepted technologies or therapies for treating addiction. One of the ideas was that you could, bring about this conscious experience or a mind-altering moment. Some people liken this to hitting rock bottom, sort of taking people to a path of, this is something that could be frightening. And for others, it was really just a very deeply and powerfully insightful moment. And so what they did is they invited people in, some volunteers, but people paid at the Hollywood Hospital facility to experience. In some respects, it created a bit of a safe room. And, as time got out, or as time passed, word got out that this was the case. But initially, they were exploring a variety of different ways of using LSD treatments to inspire people to think differently about themselves, their behaviors. And this is where sometimes people would come in the door saying, I have a problem with drinking. And what came out in those sessions was actually, I'm not happy in my marriage, or I'm uncomfortable with my lifestyle. And some of these other pieces came out, and it was a very intimate personal experience that people then wrote about. Everyone who came through this was encouraged to write their own sort of summary of what they felt happened. And in that, you see a very wide variety of pathways that people took through this program.
Now, it's only fitting that a place called Hollywood Hospital attracted some celebrity clientele, even though that's not how it got its name. You get into that in the book. Who was treated at the Hollywood Hospital and the acid room?
Well, according to the records that we have, which I'm confident are not the full set of records, there were a wide variety of people. I tried to map it at one point, and there were all these stories in local newspapers suggesting that people were actually being flown in from Los Angeles and that there was a deeper connection with Hollywood, California. The name is actually from the holly bushes that grew outside of it. But that turns out not to be so clear in the records, or those records are missing. There were some sort of elite stars who came through there, and there were some people who actually launched their careers after spending time in Hollywood. So there's a relationship there. But the vast majority of people came from Vancouver and Vancouver area. But people came from as far as Mexico, Paris, New York. There were a number of people who came for this sort of quiet, discreet therapy session that could sort of create what they described as the equivalent of 10 years of psychotherapy in a weekend.
And as you say, word certainly did get out, but it turns out not everyone was a fan of the acid room and the operators of Hollywood Hospital. Certainly not the BC College of Physicians and Surgeons or the head of psychiatry at Vancouver General Hospital. In fact, as you get into in the book, some very powerful forces working against the acid room, in fact.
Yeah, so Jim Tyhurst, who you're alluding to here, who's sort of this central figure in psychiatry in BC, but also in Canada, he joins a commission in Canada that ultimately encourages the government to criminalize psychedelics and a whole variety of things, speed, benzos, whatnot. There's this controversy where psychiatry at this time is kind of splitting, and some are very much against this single dose or rare dose, mega dose sometimes therapy, and yet we find in hindsight much more supportive of what we might think of today as a typical daily dose psychopharmaceutical regimen. Now, there are, of course, commercial and economic implications with those different models, and that's one of the critiques now of these folks who lined up with what we see today as more standard treatment, the daily dose. So Jim Tyhurst is kind of tangled up in that a little bit too. He's quite critical of the role that's being played by Hollywood Hospital and psychedelic therapists across Canada. But it's later revealed that he maybe had some, maybe his reasons were not also altruistic.
Now, what would you say the legacy of Hollywood Hospital is today? It was obviously quite ahead of its time.
You know, I find it fascinating, and Jesse and I've had this conversation about, the role that Vancouver has played in testing out different ideas about drug use. And I don't mean through some kind of coordinated effort, but there's a lot of different stories that come through this place. And so I think Hollywood gets added to that list now of, things that happened in Vancouver that were both innovative, sometimes quite punitive. I mean, some of the anti-opium smoking rules were, I would say, not progressive or innovative. And yet Vancouver continues to be this kind of testing ground, this space where you see different people, reformers, advocates, coming together and really sort of pushing us in terms of developing more creative public policy. And so I'm really proud to put Hollywood Hospital on the map, because I think it's kind of faded from memory. And like I said, it was a little bit off the beaten path in some respects. Like if it had been in Gastown, maybe this would be a different story, more well-known. But in interviews we did with people who described themselves as, casual takers or weekenders of psychedelic trips in the 1960s from Vancouver, they were not familiar. The anecdotal people I spoke with, at least, were not even familiar with Hollywood Hospital. So I think it's nice to sort of bring that story to the Canadian reading public and really remind us that Vancouver has this really colorful history that, is more complex maybe than we think.
And besides a terrific story, well told, what do you hope people take away from the book?
Well, I'm really keen to see where psychedelics are going, the future of psychedelics. And I think, my role as a historian and my thoughts as a historian is that there's a lot still that we can learn from looking back before we sort of forge forward. And some of the tensions that exist in this book, I think, are ones that we might want to continue to wrestle with today as Health Canada considers the role that psilocybin might play, for example, in end-of-life care or in treating PTSD. All of these things are very much present in the minds of reformers today, and certainly psychedelic advocates. But I think there's also some cautionary tales that we might want to just reflect on before we think about going down the path of cannabis, for example, and really thinking about the role that healthcare has to play in mediating some of the consequences of decriminalizing drugs like psychedelics.
As you say, some of those same problems are with us today.
Precisely, yeah.
All right, the name of the book is The Acid Room, The Psychedelic Trials and Tribulations of Hollywood Hospital. It's available from Anvil Press. My thanks to co-author Erika Dyck.
Thanks so much, John. It's a pleasure being here.